The night was rain-heavy, silver threads slicing through the dark. A car, sleek and black, stood stranded under a flickering streetlight. Inside, a man in a torn white shirt trembled, his breathing shallow, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't hurt me," he said, the rain swallowing the rest. His cufflinks gleamed faintly, engraved with his initials, A.D. Stone, billionaire, CEO, the kind of man who didn't kneel for anyone. Yet here he was, unable to move, pleading to a stranger whose shoes were soaked and whose palms were shaking for an entirely different reason. Before we dive deeper, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me how far a single story can travel. Drop your city. Let's see how wide kindness still spreads. The man standing outside the car was Thomas Hale, 38, construction worker, father of one, barely making rent. His jacket clung to his shoulders, heavy with rain. He hadn't planned to be out tonight. He'd been driving home after his second shift, trying to stay awake, when he saw the crash, a luxury car wrapped around a guardrail like a broken toy. At first, he thought of driving past. Not because he didn't care, but because life had taught him that the world rarely stopped for people like him. But then he heard it. A faint tapping against glass, a sound of desperation that cuts through exhaustion like a blade. Thomas parked his truck, sprinted through the storm, and pulled at the car door. "Hey, you okay?" he shouted. The man inside barely turned his head. His face, pale, blood streaking down one side. "I can't move," he whispered. "Please, my legs." Thomas's heart pounded. He'd seen the man's face before. On magazine covers, news panels, advertisements about innovation and success. Adrian Stone, the youngest self-made billionaire in the country. The same man who'd just announced layoffs at a factory not 10 miles from Thomas's home. Thomas remembered the news vividly because that factory had been his friend's last job. He froze. Every instinct battled inside him. Anger, pity, disbelief. He could walk away. No one would ever know. But then Adrian coughed, blood trickling at the corner of his lips, and everything changed. Thomas grabbed the door handle and yanked hard. "Come on, stay with me," he yelled, forcing the jammed metal to give way. He reached in, unbuckling the seatbelt, careful not to jar the man's legs. The smell of gasoline was growing sharp now. One spark and "Don't let me die," Adrian muttered. "You won't," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "Not tonight." He hooked his arms under Adrian's shoulders and pulled him out, inch by inch. The rain hissed against the flames, starting to crawl up the front hood. Thomas stumbled backward, dragging the man to safety just as the car burst into an orange roar. They both fell onto the wet asphalt, coughing, gasping for breath. For a moment there was silence, just the rain and two men from opposite worlds lying side by side, one bleeding, one shaking. If you were there in that moment, what would you have done? Be honest. Comment your answer below. And if words fail you, just hit like to prove that compassion still matters. Thomas looked at Adrian, who was staring at the burning wreck, dazed. "Ambulance is coming," Thomas said, pulling his phone from his pocket with trembling fingers. "You're gonna be okay." Adrian turned his head, wincing. "Why did you help me?" His voice cracked on the last word. Thomas didn't know what to say. Because it was the right thing? Because his daughter Lily was waiting for him to come home, and he wanted her to grow up in a world where people still cared? He looked down, rain dripping from his eyelashes. Because someone had to. Adrian's eyes softened, confusion mixing with gratitude. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," Thomas said quietly. The sound of sirens pierced the distance, drawing closer. Thomas stayed beside him until the flashing red lights painted the night in trembling color. When the paramedics arrived, Thomas helped lift Adrian onto the stretcher, then stepped back, his clothes drenched, his hands trembling. "Sir, you should get checked too," one of them said. "I'm fine," Thomas lied. "Just tired." As they loaded Adrian into the ambulance, their eyes met for a fleeting second. Something unspoken passing between them. A silent acknowledgement that this night would not be forgotten by either man. Thomas stood there until the ambulance disappeared beyond the bend, swallowed by rain and sirens. Then he turned, walked back to his dented truck, and drove into the dark, unaware that his life had just collided with something far greater than fate. The next morning, Thomas woke to the faint hum of morning traffic and the soft voice of his daughter, Lily, singing off-key to the cartoon playing on the TV. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled like last night, damp asphalt and metal. He sat at the kitchen table, rubbing the back of his neck, every muscle sore. His phone buzzed with notifications, local news, social feeds, headlines. Billionaire CEO Adrian Stone survives fiery crash. Unidentified man saves his life and disappears into the storm, Thomas sighed. He didn't tell anyone it was him. The thought of being noticed by the world made him uneasy. He didn't want interviews or cameras. He just wanted to go back to work, make Lily breakfast, and pay next month's rent. Lily patted over in her socks, hair a golden tangle. "Daddy, did you hear? A man almost died! Mrs. Porter said it was on the news." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I heard. Do you think someone helped him?" Thomas's eyes flicked to the flickering TV screen. Adrian's face filled the frame, bruised, eyes weary but alive. "Yeah," he said softly. "Someone did." He poured her cereal, watching the milk swirl like clouds. The image of Adrian's pale, shaking hands wouldn't leave him. He wondered if the man remembered his face. Probably not. People like that had entire worlds built around them, lawyers, guards, assistants. A stranger in a raincoat wouldn't stick. But he was wrong. Because across the city, in a private hospital suite smelling faintly of antiseptic and lilies, Adrian Stone couldn't stop replaying that voice. "You're gonna be okay." It had cut through the panic like sunlight through smoke. His assistant, Grace, was reading through the news aloud. "They're calling it a miracle, sir." The company issued a statement. "Forget the statement," Adrian said, his voice still rough. "Find him," Grace blinked. "The man who saved you?" "Yes, there were security cameras on that road, weren't there? Check the footage. Call the police if you have to. I want to thank him." Grace hesitated. "Sir, the board—" "I don't care about the board." She nodded quickly and left the room. Adrian leaned back, wincing as pain shot through his ribs. His mind flicked to the look in the man's eyes, tired, human, full of something money couldn't buy anymore. Empathy. He thought about how many people he'd passed by without seeing. How many had begged him for a chance, a job, a day's mercy, and now here he was, saved by one of them. Later that day, Thomas clocked in at the construction site. His co-worker, Marcus, was scrolling on his phone during break. "Yo, Hale," he called, grinning. "You look like that guy they're talking about." Thomas forced a laugh. "Yeah, sure. Me saving a billionaire. You've been inhaling too much paint thinner." But Marcus turned his screen toward him, a blurry still from a security camera showing a man dragging another from the flames. The face was hard to see through the rain, but it was him. Thomas's stomach dropped. "You should go to the press, man," Marcus said. "You'd be famous overnight." Thomas shook his head. "Fame doesn't pay bills." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Neither does staying invisible." That night, while Lily slept on the couch, Thomas sat by the window, watching city lights smear across wet glass. The wind was cool, whispering through the cracks. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Hale, this is Grace Layton, assistant to Mr. Adrian Stone. He wishes to meet you personally to express his gratitude. Transportation will be arranged at your convenience." Thomas stared at the screen. His chest tightened. Somehow it felt heavier than last night's fire. He typed back, "You've got the wrong guy," then deleted it. Rewrote it. Deleted again. He finally shut off the phone and whispered to himself, "People like him don't thank people like me." But inside, something flickered. Curiosity, maybe even hope. Because what if, just once, someone really meant it? Have you ever had someone help you when no one else would? Write yes and tell me their name. Maybe gratitude can travel further than we think. The next morning, Thomas found a sleek black car waiting outside his building. Grace stepped out, calm, polished, the kind of person who looked out of place in his part of town. "Mr. Hale?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's me," Mr. Stone insisted. She said gently. "He wants to see you today." Thomas hesitated, glancing at the cracked concrete beneath his boots. "Can I bring my daughter?" Grace blinked, then smiled softly. "Of course." Lily's small hand slipped into his. "Are we going somewhere, Daddy?" He looked down at her, heart twisting. "Yeah, baby," he murmured. "Somewhere different." The ride was silent. The city looked different from this car, quieter, slower, unreal. When they arrived at the hospital, Grace led them through white halls until they stopped at a private room door. Adrian looked up as they entered. His face was pale, but his eyes softened when they met Thomas's. "You came," he whispered. Thomas nodded awkwardly. "Didn't think you'd remember." "I couldn't forget," Adrian said. "You pulled me out of hell!" Lily stood half hidden behind her father, clutching his sleeve. "Are you the man from TV?" she asked. Adrian smiled faintly. "I guess I am." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You don't need to thank me. You'd have done the same." Adrian looked away, a flicker of guilt shadowing his face. "I'm not sure I would have," he admitted quietly, and for the first time, Thomas believed him. The room fell into a soft, uneasy silence. Adrian studied Thomas for a long moment, the lines of fatigue under his eyes, the calloused hands, the quiet strength that came from years of survival. "Not privilege. You saved my life," Adrian said finally. "And I owe you far more than words," Thomas shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." But Adrian wasn't listening. He turned to Grace. "Set up a meeting with our HR head. I want Mr. Hale hired at the main site. Foreman position." Thomas froze. "What?" "No, I didn't come here for charity." Adrian looked at him, almost pleading. "It's not charity, it's gratitude." Thomas felt the weight of Lily's eyes on him. She was tracing her finger along the seam of the hospital curtain, humming softly. He swallowed hard. "I've worked construction my whole life," he said. "I can't run an office." Adrian smiled faintly. "Neither could I when I started." Grace cleared her throat. "Mr. Stone, maybe we should discuss this." "No," Adrian interrupted. "This man deserves more than thanks. He deserves a chance." Thomas clenched his jaw, torn between pride and survival. He wanted to refuse, but then he thought about the overdue bills stuffed in his kitchen drawer and Lily's shoes that were one size too small. "Just let me think about it," he said quietly. Adrian nodded. "Of course." Lily walked closer to the bed, her voice small. "Did you get hurt bad, mister?" Adrian smiled softly. "A little. But I'll be okay thanks to your dad," she grinned. "He's good at fixing things." Thomas blinked, surprised by how simply she said it, as if kindness was just another trade skill. When they left the hospital, Grace handed Thomas a small envelope. "Mr. Stone wanted you to have this." Inside was a check, more zeros than Thomas had ever seen in his life. His fingers trembled. "I can't take this," he muttered. Grace smiled gently. "You already earned it." That night, Thomas sat at the table staring at the check. The TV murmured in the background, and Lily was drawing a sun with crayon, humming again. He thought about Adrian's face, the vulnerability behind the power, the guilt in his voice. Maybe the man wasn't as untouchable as everyone thought. Maybe no one really was. The next day, Thomas walked to the construction site and handed his foreman his resignation notice. "You sure about this?" the man asked. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I think it's time to start somewhere new." For the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. "Now it's your turn. Share one small good thing you did recently. Write it below so others remember that humanity still lives." Your story might light someone's path tonight. A week later, Thomas arrived at the Stone Industries headquarters. Towering glass, sunlight spilling through marble floors. He felt out of place, his work boots echoing against the polished surface. Grace greeted him warmly, introducing him to a team of engineers and managers. "Don't worry," she whispered. "Mr. Stone's been asking about you every day." Thomas nodded awkwardly. He'd worn his best shirt, which still had a faint stain from last winter's storm. Hours later, when the orientation ended, Adrian requested to see him privately. His leg was still wrapped in bandages, but his voice was steadier now. "I'm glad you came," he said. "How does it feel being here?" Thomas hesitated. "Strange. Like I don't belong," Adrian smiled faintly. "You belong more than most people I know." Thomas sat down. "Why me? You could have picked anyone." "Because I've built a company on ambition," Adrian said quietly. "But you reminded me what it means to build a life." Thomas looked away, his throat tight. "You don't have to fix what happened out there." Adrian shook his head. "I'm not fixing anything. I'm trying to start over." That sentence lingered in the air like a confession. Outside the office window, the city gleamed. Endless motion, endless noise. But inside, for the first time, there was quiet understanding. "Tell me something," Thomas said suddenly. "Those layoffs last month, did you ever meet the people who lost their jobs?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "No, I didn't." "Then maybe that's where you start," Thomas said softly. "Meet them. See what you broke," Adrian exhaled, looking down at his hands. "You think I can make it right?" Thomas stood, adjusting his jacket. "You can try. That's more than most do." Adrian nodded slowly, the words sinking deep. "Then I will." As Thomas turned to leave, Adrian said quietly, "Thomas, I used to think success was about never falling. But you showed me it's about what you do when you're on the ground." Thomas paused at the doorway. "Then maybe you're finally standing for the first time." Their eyes met, and for the briefest second, the distance between billionaire and builder disappeared. Two men who'd both been broken, both still learning how to heal. Days blurred into a rhythm Thomas hadn't known before. Meetings, planning sessions, safety audits. He wasn't sure he belonged among spreadsheets and project charts, but people began to notice the way he listened, the quiet steadiness in his voice when others argued. Grace often watched from a distance, smiling slightly. At home, Lily colored on the floor while Thomas studied late into the night. He wanted to prove he deserved this chance, not because Adrian gave it to him, but because he'd earned it through something real. One afternoon, as Thomas was reviewing site plans, Adrian walked into the office without warning. The usual swarm of assistants trailed behind, but he waved them off. "Thomas," he said, "come with me." Thomas followed him through the corridors until they reached a large glass conference room overlooking the skyline. Inside were half a dozen men and women, some of the workers recently laid off. Thomas recognized one immediately, Marcus, his old co-worker. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Tom, you work here?" "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. Adrian stepped forward, his voice clear but hesitant. "I brought you all here to apologize," he began. "I made decisions without understanding their cost. I thought efficiency meant progress. I was wrong. The room was still." Marcus crossed his arms. "You think saying sorry fixes putting people out on the street?" Adrian's voice wavered. "No, but it's a start." Thomas stood beside him, watching the tension coil through the room like wire. He could see both sides, the anger of those who'd lost everything and the guilt of a man learning to face it. "Maybe," Thomas said softly, "it's not about fixing. Maybe it's about rebuilding." Everyone turned to him. "You can't undo what happened," he continued, "but you can show up differently now. Hire back who you can. Fund what you broke. People forgive action, not words." Adrian looked at him, truly looked, and nodded. "Then that's what I'll do." Over the next few weeks, Adrian began reinstating jobs, opening a program to support laid-off workers. He even visited the local factory himself. No cameras, no press, just him and the people whose lives had been torn by his choices. Thomas went with him each time. Watching Adrian face their questions, their resentment, their pain, it changed something in him too. Because forgiveness, he realized, was never easy. It was a choice you made every day until the hurt softened into understanding. If that moment hit you hard, leave a E. Sometimes one little symbol says what our hearts can't. One evening, Adrian showed up at Thomas's apartment unannounced. He looked different. Simpler somehow, wearing jeans instead of tailored suits. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said when Thomas opened the door. "I was nearby and I wanted to see how you and Lily were." Thomas hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You're lucky it's not laundry day." Lily ran to the door, her face lighting up. "Mr. Stone!" she squealed. "You're walking again." Adrian laughed softly. Slowly, but yes. She tugged him inside like he was family, not a man whose name could buy skyscrapers. Adrian looked around, the worn couch, the stack of unpaid bills tucked under a mug, the framed photo of a woman on the shelf. Thomas noticed his gaze linger. "That's her," he said quietly. "Lily's mom. She passed a few years ago." Adrian's voice softened. "I'm sorry," Thomas nodded. "Yeah, she was sick. Hospital bills. They took everything." Silence hung between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Adrian sat on the couch, folding his hands. "You know," he said, "I used to think people like me had it harder. The pressure, the expectations. But then I see how much you've carried, alone, and I realize how small my problems really were." Thomas shook his head. "Pain doesn't come with a price tag. It just finds you where you are." Adrian smiled faintly, almost grateful. "That's something I needed to hear." Lily ran over, handing him one of her drawings, a stick figure version of the three of them standing under a bright yellow sun. "This is us," she said proudly. Adrian looked at it for a long moment. His voice cracked just slightly. "Thank you, Lily." He folded the paper carefully as if it were gold. "Be honest. Could you forgive after what they did? Type forgive if you could, or never, if it would break you too deeply." That night, after Adrian left, Thomas stood by the window again, city lights flickering below. Something inside him felt lighter, like the world had shifted a little closer to right. He thought about how two men from opposite worlds had somehow found the same ground, not through power or pity, but through shared humanity. And somewhere deep down, he hoped this was only the beginning. Weeks turned into months. What started as gratitude became a quiet bond neither man had expected. Adrian recovered fully, but he kept visiting the construction sites with Thomas. No cameras, no announcements, just work gloves and questions. The workers didn't believe it at first. "That's him?" they'd whisper, watching the billionaire carry planks beside a man who used to sleep in his truck. But as days passed, the disbelief turned into a strange kind of respect. Adrian listened, really listened when they spoke. He asked about safety, wages, and how things could be better. One afternoon, as they took a break by the scaffolding, Adrian turned to Thomas. "You ever think about how close it was that night?" Thomas glanced at him, wiping sweat from his brow. "Close to what?" "To me dying." "To us never meeting. One more minute and I would have burned alive." Thomas gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Guess that's what they call a second chance." Adrian looked at the skyline. Cranes against blue, clouds drifting lazily. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm starting to think those aren't given." "They're earned," Thomas chuckled. "Well, you're working for it now." He meant it as a joke, but Adrian nodded seriously. "I hope so." A few feet away, Lily was drawing again, her crayons scattered across a piece of plywood. She'd become the heartbeat of every visit, chatting with workers, handing out her sun pictures, as she called them. Each one had the same message scrawled in crooked letters. "Be kind, okay?" One day, as Thomas was about to leave for work, Lily held up one of her drawings. "Can you give this to Mr. Stone?" she said. "It's for when he feels sad," Thomas smiled. "You think he gets sad?" She nodded seriously. "Everyone does, Daddy. Even rich people." He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his pocket. At the office that afternoon, Thomas found Adrian standing alone in the glass hallway, staring down at the city below. "You ever feel," Adrian said quietly, "like the higher you climb, the lonelier it gets?" Thomas pulled the crumpled drawing from his pocket and handed it over. "My daughter thinks you might." Adrian unfolded it, 3 smiling stick figures under a big yellow sun. For a moment, his face softened completely. "She's right," he said, his voice breaking just slightly. She's always right, he turned toward Thomas. You know, I used to think I was untouchable. Money made me believe that. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being ordinary. Scared of feeling small. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe that's what makes us human. Being scared and showing up anyway. Adrian looked at him, the city's reflection trembling in his eyes. I think I finally get it now. If you believe love still wins, comment amen. Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. 2 months later, Stone Industries held its first community outreach event. The company had rebuilt one of the old factories into a training center. Free courses for unemployed workers, scholarships for children, safety reforms that came from Thomas's notes. The local news called it the Stone Turnaround. But for Thomas, it wasn't about headlines. It was about walking through that building and seeing people smiling again. The same faces that once cursed Adrian's name now laughing beside him. As the ceremony ended, Adrian took the stage. Cameras flashed, but his speech wasn't rehearsed. 6 months ago, he began, I was a man with everything, except meaning. Then someone reminded me that life isn't about building empires. It's about building people. He turned slightly toward Thomas in the crowd. That man is here today, and I'll never forget what he taught me. Applause filled the hall. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to being seen like this, not as a worker, but as someone who mattered. After the event, Adrian walked over, holding out a small, folded envelope. For Lily, he said. Scholarship fund. For when she's ready to chase her own son. Thomas blinked, struggling to find words. You don't have to... I know, Adrian interrupted softly. That's why I want to. For a long moment, they just stood there. No suits, no dirt, no titles. Just 2 men who'd somehow rebuilt something far bigger than a business. Thomas extended his hand. Guess you're learning, boss, Adrian smiled. Guess I had a good teacher. As the crowd faded, Thomas looked up at the evening sky, gold melting into deep blue. And for the first time in years, he believed that maybe good people could still change the world. Later that night, the city was quiet again. Thomas drove home under a sky full of slow-moving clouds, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small head leaning against the window, her fingers clutching the little stuffed bear she never went anywhere without. He stopped at a red light, and for a moment, he just breathed. The hum of the engine, the flicker of the traffic light, the echo of applause still lingering in his mind. All of it felt unreal. How did a man who once worked night shifts and counted quarters at gas stations end up standing beside the richest man in the city? He didn't know. But he did know one thing. Kindness had taken him further than anger ever could. When he reached home, he carried Lily to bed, tucked her in, and sat on the edge for a while, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Her breathing was soft, rhythmic, the kind of peace he'd fought years to give her. He turned off the light and whispered, We're gonna be okay, baby. Then he went to his small kitchen table, opened the envelope Adrian had given him, and saw the note inside. In careful handwriting, it read, For Lily, because your drawings reminded me what sunshine feels like. For Thomas, because you taught me that saving a life doesn't end with pulling someone out of fire. Thomas smiled. A tear slid down his cheek before he could stop it. A few days later, Adrian called unexpectedly. His voice was quieter than usual. Thomas, I need you to come with me. There's something I want to show you. An hour later, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of a park still under renovation. It wasn't big, a few trees, a pond, benches being painted by volunteers, but there was a plaque at the entrance, the Hale Garden, dedicated to everyday heroes. Thomas stared at it, his heart catching in his throat. You named this after me? Adrian nodded. After what you did, and for everyone who does good without expecting anything back. Thomas didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of it, not pride, but gratitude so deep it hurt. Adrian, I don't deserve this. Yes, Adrian said softly. You do, because this isn't just about saving me. It's about saving what I'd forgotten, that humanity still lives. Thomas looked around, the sunlight glinting off wet grass, children laughing as volunteers planted flowers. For the first time, he saw the change ripple outward, not just from one act, but from the echo of it. They stood there in silence for a while. The world felt gentler somehow. Funny, Thomas said quietly. You used to build towers. Now you build gardens. Adrian smiled faintly. Gardens last longer. A few days later, a storm rolled in again, rain lashing against windows, wind howling down narrow streets. Adrian called Thomas late that night. Power's out at my place, he said with a tired laugh. Feels like déjà vu, Thomas chuckled. You need me to pull you out of another wreck? Not tonight, Adrian said. Just company. So Thomas packed a thermos of coffee and drove through the rain. They sat by candlelight in Adrian's living room, the storm thundering outside like an old memory. You know what I realized? Adrian said, watching the candle flame flicker. All my life I thought people respected me for being strong. But the truth is I only found real strength when I learned to be weak. Thomas nodded. Took me a long time to learn that too. Then maybe we're both still learning. They sat in the soft glow. No more walls between them. Just two men who had both been broken and somehow found peace in each other's flaws. The thunder rumbled like applause from the heavens. If this story moved you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like. Not for me, but for the soul who carried this pain and still stayed kind. One click can be your way of saying, I felt you. The storm faded by dawn. When Thomas stepped outside, the streets shimmered, puddles glowing gold in the rising light. He looked back at the house where Adrian stood in the doorway, hand raised in silent thanks. Thomas smiled, tipping his head slightly. No grand words, no promises. Just a quiet understanding that their lives, though so different, were now permanently intertwined. Not by fate, but by choice. As he drove home, the city stirred awake. And somewhere deep in his chest, Thomas felt it. The warmth that comes not from wealth or luck, but from doing something good, something right, even when no one's watching. The following weeks brought a rhythm of quiet grace. Thomas returned to work, though his days now carried something gentler, laughter from the crew, respect in their nods, warmth that had nothing to do with hierarchy. Adrian visited the sites less often now, but when he did, the workers greeted him with genuine smiles, not forced ones. Something had changed in all of them. Thomas didn't see himself as a hero. He just did what anyone should do. But the truth was, his small act had started something far beyond him. One morning, while walking Lily to school, a man approached them on the corner. Middle-aged, tired eyes, familiar face. You're Thomas Hale, right? He asked, voice trembling. Thomas blinked. Yeah, that's me. The man smiled, holding out his hand. You don't know me, but I worked at the factory Mr. Stone reopened. I got my job back because of you. His voice cracked. You saved more lives than you realize. Thomas didn't know what to say. He just shook the man's hand firmly. Then do something good with it, he said. The man nodded. I will. As they walked away, Lily looked up at him, her eyes bright. See, Daddy? You made people happy, he smiled faintly. Maybe we both did, she giggled. Then we're like superheroes. Thomas laughed. Really laughed, for the first time in years. Guess we are. That evening, Thomas got a call from Grace. Mr. Stone wants you to come by, she said. It's important. When he arrived, Adrian was standing by a window again, but this time he wasn't alone. A lawyer was beside him, holding a folder. Adrian turned, his expression unreadable. Thomas, I'm stepping down, Thomas blinked. What? I'm resigning as CEO, Adrian said quietly. It's time for someone else to lead. I want to start something new, something that actually means something. Thomas frowned. You're walking away from billions, Adrian smiled faintly. I'm walking toward peace. The lawyer handed Thomas an envelope. This, Adrian said, is for you. Not a gift, a partnership. The new foundation we're building will focus on community programs, rebuilding neighborhoods, funding education. I can't think of anyone more qualified to lead it than you. Thomas's throat tightened. I don't know anything about foundations. You know everything about people, Adrian said. That's what matters. Silence hung for a moment before Thomas spoke, voice low. You really think I can do this? Adrian nodded. I don't just think it. I know it. Something in Thomas's chest broke. Not from pain this time, but from the unbearable weight of gratitude. He reached across the table and shook Adrian's hand. Then let's make it count. They both smiled. Not the polished kind for cameras, but the weary, honest kind that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed you. Months later, the Hale Foundation opened its doors. It wasn't grand, just a converted warehouse filled with volunteers, kids laughing, and walls covered in Lily's sun drawings. Each one signed with her name and a small message. Be kind, even when it's hard. Adrian stood beside Thomas during the ribbon cutting, both of them dressed simply. When the crowd applauded, Thomas didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the children running across the courtyard, their laughter echoing through the air. He turned to Adrian. Think your investors would approve of this? Adrian chuckled. If they don't, they can invest in something else, Thomas laughed, shaking his head. You really have changed? Adrian smiled. No, you just reminded me who I was supposed to be. The sun began to dip, painting everything in gold. Lily came running up, holding a tiny pot of flowers. Daddy, look! I planted this myself. Thomas crouched beside her, his eyes glistening. It's beautiful, baby. What kind is it? She grinned. Hope! Thomas laughed softly, glancing at Adrian, who was already wiping at his eyes. Hope, Thomas repeated. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. If you believe love still wins, comment Amen. Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. As the day faded into night, Thomas stood alone for a moment, watching the lights flicker on in the new building. He could hear Lily laughing somewhere inside, her voice blending with others, full of life, full of future. He thought about the man he used to be, tired, angry, lost, and the man he'd become, not perfect, not rich, but finally whole. Sometimes, he thought, the real miracle isn't in being saved. It's in learning how to keep saving others. The evening settled soft and golden around the new foundation, the sound of laughter spilling out through the open doors like music. Volunteers were cleaning up after the event, children still running across the courtyard, the last light of sunset catching in their hair. Thomas stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, quietly watching it all unfold. The living proof that kindness could, in fact, ripple outward. Adrian joined him a moment later, a faint limp still in his step. You ever think about that night? He asked quietly. Thomas smiled. Every day, but not because of what happened, because of what came after. Adrian nodded. It's strange. I spent years trying to build an empire, and it took losing everything to understand that real power comes from giving, not taking. Thomas looked out at Lily, who was now helping a little boy plant another flower in the dirt. She gets it better than most adults, he said softly. Adrian chuckled. She's her father's daughter. Thomas turned toward him. No, she's the person I hope to become. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laughter born not from humor, but from peace. Inside, Grace was talking with the volunteers, her laughter bright. She caught Thomas's eye, smiled, and mouthed, You did it. He shook his head slightly. We did. Adrian took a slow breath. You know, I used to believe money could buy anything, but it couldn't buy what you gave me that night. Thomas looked at him, brows furrowed. What's that? Forgiveness, Adrian said simply. You didn't know me, and you still saw me as human. That's the kind of grace I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live up to. Thomas's chest tightened, the words sinking deep. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. What matters is what we do after them. The two men stood there, side by side, not CEO and laborer anymore, not billionaire and savior, just two men who'd met in fire and found something purer in the ashes. The sky deepened into twilight, the first stars blinking awake. A warm breeze stirred the banner above the entrance, the Hale Foundation. Building hope, one heart at a time. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Thomas locked up the building. Lily was already dozing in the back seat of the truck, her small hand still clutching a paper sun. He took one last look at the glowing windows. It reminded him of something his wife used to say before she passed. "The light you give away is the only one that never burns out." He smiled, whispering to the empty air, "You were right." As he climbed into the truck and started the engine, his phone buzzed, a text from Adrian. "Thank you for teaching me how to live again," Thomas typed back, his thumb pausing before hitting send. "Thank you for listening. That's all the world ever needed." He drove through the quiet streets, the world outside washed clean by the evening breeze. In the distance, neon lights blinked lazily, and life and in all its beauty and cruelty went on. But tonight felt different, softer, kinder. Because somewhere between a crash and a kindness, two broken men had rewritten what survival meant. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, warm and gentle. Lily climbed onto the bed, shaking him awake. "Daddy, get up! We're gonna be late for the park!" He groaned playfully. "The park can wait 5 more minutes." "No, it can't. Mr. Stone said he's bringing ice cream." Thomas laughed, pulling her into a hug. All right. Let's go see if the world's still turning." She giggled, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. "It always is, Daddy. You fixed it." He froze, not sure whether to laugh or cry. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, kissing her forehead. "It fixed itself when people started caring again." As they walked down the street later that day, the city around them looked different. Or maybe Thomas had just learned to see it differently. The same buildings, the same traffic, the same tired faces. But there were smiles now, nods, quiet kindnesses happening between strangers. And he realized something profound, that one act of compassion could stretch across 1,000 lives. Long after the moment had passed, he took Lily's hand, her small fingers wrapping around his calloused ones, and felt the world settle into a peace he hadn't known since before everything fell apart. Sometimes redemption didn't arrive in grand gestures or second chances. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in rain-soaked nights, trembling hands, and the simple choice to save a stranger. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. If this story moved you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like. Not for me, but for the soul who carried this pain and still stayed kind. One click can be your way of saying, "I felt you." Because maybe, somewhere out there, another heart needs to believe that kindness still wins, and your small act could be the spark that keeps it alive.